The air inside the municipal courtroom was thick and stale, smelling faintly of old paper and floor wax. It was a Tuesday morning, not that the day of the week mattered much to the people waiting in the hard wooden pews. For them, it was just another day of waiting for a stranger in a black robe to decide their fate. At the front of the room, sitting alone on a bench that was slightly too small for him, was Arthur. He was a man in his late 60s, though the deep lines etched into his face and the snowy white color of his hair made him look older. He wore a faded Greenfield jacket, the kind soldiers used to wear, the cuffs fraying and a small American flag pinned to the lapel. His hands, rough and spotted with age, rested calmly on his knees, clutching a tan folder stuffed with loose papers. Across the aisle, the atmosphere was completely different. There sat Mr. Henderson, a property developer known around the city for his expensive suits and his ability to buy anything he wanted. He wasn't wearing a jacket. He had draped it over the back of his chair, looking completely at ease. Next to him was a young, sharp-looking lawyer in a suit that probably cost more than Arthur's truck. They were speaking in low voices, chuckling about something that had nothing to do with the law. They looked like they were waiting for a lunch reservation, rather than a court hearing. The case before the judge was a dispute over a small, scrubby piece of land on the edge of town. To anyone passing by, it looked like nothing more than a patch of weeds and dirt. But to Arthur, it was everything. It was the place where he went every single day to pull weeds, plant flowers, and sit on a rough wooden bench he had built himself. It was a memorial. But to Mr. Henderson, it was a missing piece of a puzzle of vacant lot that would complete his new apartment complex project. All rise, the bailiff shouted. Though his voice lacked energy, the judge swept into the room, his black robes rustling. He was a man who looked tired of his job. He moved quickly to his chair, sat down, and immediately started shuffling through a towering stack of files. He didn't look at the people in the room. He just wanted to get through the list. Next case, the judge barked, not bothering to look up. Henderson versus He squinted at the paper. The estate of unknown parties regarding the vacant lot on Oak Creek Road. Arthur stood up slowly. His joints popped audibly in the quiet room. He buttoned his field jacket with shaking fingers and took a step toward the wooden table reserved for defendants. He was alone. He didn't have a lawyer. He couldn't afford one. "I am here, Your Honor," Arthur said. His voice was quiet, raspy from years of smoking and breathing in dust. But it was clear. The judge finally looked over his spectacles. He sighed, a long, exasperated sound that seemed to deflate his whole body. He looked at Arthur, then at the expensive lawyer sitting comfortably at the other table. The judge had seen this 1,000 times. He saw a wealthy developer with proper legal representation and an old man who looked like he had wandered in off the street looking for a warm place to sleep. In the judge's mind, the outcome was obvious. This was just a formality. "Mr. Henderson's counsel," the judge said, waving a hand toward the developer. "You may proceed. Make it quick. We have a full docket." The young lawyer stood up. He smiled a polished, white-toothed smile at the judge. He didn't even look at Arthur. It was as if Arthur wasn't worth the effort of acknowledging. "Thank you, Your Honor," the lawyer began. "This is a straightforward case of adverse possession. My client, Mr. Henderson, has maintained the taxes and the perimeter security of the parcel in question for over 5 years. The individual standing there," he gestured vaguely to, warned Arthur with a pen, "has no legal deed, no claim of ownership, and has been trespassing on private property for the better part of a decade. We are seeking an immediate ejectment so that construction can begin on Monday." The lawyer spoke quickly, using big words that tumbled over one another. He talked about statutes and limitations and precedents. He made it sound so clean, so simple. He made it sound like Arthur was just a nuisance, a squatter who was preventing progress. Arthur tried to interject. "Your Honor, if I may," the judge cut him off with a sharp glare. "You will have your turn, sir, but I suggest you listen to the law first." Arthur closed his mouth. He looked down at his folder. He knew he wasn't good at speaking like the lawyer. He didn't know the fancy terms. He just knew what was right, the lawyer continued. "Your Honor, we have the tax records. We have the city planning maps. There is no record of a cemetery or a park. It is just zoned as vacant residential land. This man is simply occupying space that belongs to my client. It is a clear-cut violation of property rights." The lawyer sat down, looking pleased with himself. He smoothed his tie and looked at his phone. The judge turned his gaze to Arthur. The old man's heart was hammering against his ribs, but his face remained still. He walked up to the podium. He placed his hands on the worn wood. "Your Honor," Arthur started, his voice trembling slightly, "I know I don't have the paper they say I need, but that land. It's not just dirt. I have taken care of it for 30 years. I cleared the brambles. I hauled away the trash. People my friends rest there. It's sacred ground. You can't just build apartments over top of them." The judge stared at him. He tapped his pen on the desk. Tap, tap, tap. "It was an impatient rhythm, sir," the judge said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Sentiment does not outweigh property law. You admit you have no deed? You admit you have no legal ownership?" "I admit I own the responsibility," Arthur said firmly. "I promise to look after it." "A promise is not a deed," the judge snapped. He looked at the clock on the wall. He had a lunch meeting in 20 minutes, and this case was annoying him. It was open and shut. In his experience, people like Arthur were just looking for a handout or a place to stay rent-free. He didn't have time for ghost stories about sacred ground. Mr. Henderson spoke up from his seat, leaning back comfortably. "Your Honor, if I may, we are willing to drop the back taxes claim if he just leaves quietly. We don't want to be cruel." The judge nodded as if this was a great gesture of kindness. "You see, the plaintiff is being generous." Arthur turned to look at Henderson. His eyes were cold, hard flint. He didn't want their generosity. He wanted them to leave his friends alone. "They aren't back taxes," Arthur said, louder this time. "I paid for the stones and the fence with my own money. That is the only tax that matters there." The judge had heard enough. He picked up his gavel. The impatience in the room reached a boiling point. The lawyer was checking his watch. The bailiff was looking at the door. The judge just wanted to clear the file. He didn't want to investigate a dusty lot in the middle of nowhere. He didn't want to hear stories from an old veteran. "Order," the judge said, though the room was already quiet. "I have heard enough arguments. The evidence presented by the plaintiff is clear and legal. The defendant has presented no documentation, only hearsay and emotional appeals." Arthur gripped the edge of the podium until his knuckles turned white. He wanted to scream. He wanted to tell them about the names, the dates, the tears he had shed on that soil. But he saw the look on the judge's face, the dismissive look that told him it wouldn't matter. "The court finds in favor of the plaintiff," the judge announced, his voice echoing off the beige walls. "Possession is 9/10 of the law, and Mr. Henderson has the legal standing. The claim of the defendant is dismissed." He raised the gavel high. Bang! The sound rang out like a gunshot. Arthur felt a physical blow to his chest, like he had been punched. He stood there, stunned. It was over, just like that. Years of work, years of memory, wiped away by a man who hadn't even left his chair. "I am granting the order of immediate ejectment," the judge continued, closing his folder. "Mr. Henderson, you are free to proceed with your development. Bailiff, please clear the courtroom so we can move to the next matter." The lawyer began packing his briefcase. A smug smile plastered on his face. Mr. Henderson stood up, buttoning his jacket, looking like a man who had just bought a new car. They didn't even look at Arthur. They treated him like a piece of furniture that was being hauled away to the curb. The bailiff stepped toward Arthur, a look of pity on his face, but also a firmness. He placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder. "Come on, son," the bailiff said gently. "You gotta go." The judge gave his order. Arthur didn't move. His feet felt like they were encased in concrete. He looked at the judge, who was already looking at the next file, completely forgetting that Arthur existed. The injustice of it burned in Arthur's throat. It wasn't about the land. It was about the respect. It was about the fact that a man in a suit could erase the existence of good men with a single word. "You can't do this," Arthur whispered, but the room was already moving on. The clerk was calling out the next case name. People were shuffling papers. The world had kept spinning, leaving Arthur behind in the wreckage of his loss. He stood alone in the center of the noise. The folder of papers clutched against his chest like a shield. The judge had dismissed his case without a second thought. To the court, Arthur was nobody. Just a nuisance that had been successfully removed. They thought it was over. They thought he would just walk away into the shadows. But Arthur hadn't spent 30 years surviving wars and burying friends just to roll over because a man in a robe said the word dismissed. The trembling in his hands stopped. The sadness in his eyes hardened into something else, something dangerous and determined. He slowly reached into the inside pocket of his field jacket. The bailiff saw the movement and tensed up, his hand going to his belt. But Arthur didn't pull out a weapon. He paused for a second, taking a deep breath, his eyes locking onto the back of the judge's head. The silence that followed was heavy, waiting for the storm that was about to break. Arthur wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The sharp sound of the gavel still seemed to vibrate in the air. But for everyone else in the room, the moment was already over. The judge had moved on. He was busy shuffling papers, his head down, already looking for the next name on his list. He wanted to forget the old man in the faded jacket just as quickly as he had ruled against him. To the judge, Arthur was just a delay, speed bump on the road to lunch. In the front row, Mr. Henderson stood up and straightened his tie. He looked like a man who had just purchased a new car. He was satisfied, relieved that the boring part of the day was done. He nudged his lawyer, and the two of them shared a quiet, triumphant smile. They didn't even look at Arthur. In their minds, he was invisible now. He had lost, so he didn't matter anymore. The bailiff, a middle-aged man with a kind face but a job to do, stepped closer to Arthur. He didn't want to be rough, but he had to clear the courtroom. The judge had given an order, and in that room, the judge's word was the only law that mattered. "Sir," the bailiff said softly, placing a hand on Arthur's elbow, "you need to gather your things and go. The judge doesn't want any scenes. Let's walk out quietly, okay?" Arthur didn't move. He didn't look at the bailiff. He stood exactly where he was, his feet planted firmly on the worn carpet. It felt like his boots had taken root in the floor. If he moved now, he felt like he would be admitting defeat, not just in court but in his soul. He wasn't just fighting for dirt anymore. He was fighting for the dignity of every person the court had ever ignored. "You need to leave now," the bailiff said, a little louder this time, his tone becoming more urgent. He tightened his grip on Arthur's arm, trying to steer him toward the exit door. Arthur reacted instantly. It wasn't a violent reaction, but it was fast. He pulled his arm away from the bailiff with a sharp, fluid twist of his shoulder. It was a move that spoke of old training, a reflex that hadn't faded with time. The bailiff stumbled back a step, surprised by the old man's strength. "I am not finished," Arthur said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a strange weight. It wasn't the trembling voice of a confused old man anymore. It was hard, like iron. The people in the pews who were whispering and packing their bags stopped what they were doing. The lawyer, halfway out of his chair, froze. Even Mr. Henderson stopped checking his phone and turned to look. The silence spread through the room like a ripple. It started at the front and moved to the back. The chatter died down. The scratching of pens stopped. Everyone felt it, the sudden, heavy pressure in the air. The mood in the courtroom had shifted. It was no longer boring. It was electric. The judge noticed the change in the noise level. He frowned, annoyed that the silence he wanted wasn't happening. He looked up from his desk, expecting to see the old man shuffling out the door. Instead, he saw Arthur standing tall in the center of the room. He saw the bailiff rubbing his arm, looking confused. "Mr. The judge squinted at his paperwork, trying to recall the name. "Sir, I told you," he snapped, his patience completely gone. "The case is dismissed. You lost. Leave immediately, or I will hold you in contempt of court. Do you understand me? You are holding up my entire morning." The judge was used to people being afraid of him. When he spoke like that, people usually apologized and ran. But Arthur didn't run. Arthur didn't even blink slowly. Deliberately, Arthur lifted his head. He looked around the room, his eyes scanning the faces of the people who were watching him. He looked at the board's stenographer, the curious onlookers, and the smug developer. Then he locked his eyes onto the judge. The transformation in Arthur's face was terrifying to see. The weary look was gone. The sadness was gone. His face was a mask of stone, cold and unreadable. His eyes were clear and focused, possessing an intensity that made the judge lean back in his leather chair involuntarily. "You can hold me in contempt," Arthur said, his voice steady and calm. "You can judge me. You can fine me. But you cannot silence the truth of that ground." The lawyer for Mr. Henderson stood up straighter, sensing that things were spiraling out of control. "Your Honor," he interrupted, "this is harassment. We request you have security remove this man immediately. Sit down." The judge barked at the lawyer, then turned his fury back to Arthur. "Sir, this is your final warning. One more word, and you will spend the night in a cell." "I have had enough of these theatrics." Arthur didn't sit down. He didn't flinch. He just stared at the judge. It was the stare of a man who had seen things the judge could only imagine. It was the stare of someone who had looked death in the face and didn't blink. The judge felt a sudden, strange chill run down his spine. He realized, with a dawning sense of horror, that the old man wasn't afraid of the gavel, the robe, or the jail cell. Arthur didn't respect the court's authority because the court had lost its moral authority in his eyes. The bailiff stepped forward again, but this time he was hesitant. He put his hand on the baton at his belt, but he didn't pull it out. He looked at the judge, waiting for a signal. The room was deadly silent. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning in the ceiling. Every person in the room was holding their breath. They were watching a standoff that felt like a wire pulled tight, about to snap. Arthur slowly moved his hands. They had been hanging by his sides, fists clenched. Now, he unclenched them. He reached into the breast pocket of his field jacket. The movement was slow and deliberate. Asterisk, don't. The bailiff shouted, stepping in front of the judge protectively. He thought Arthur might have a gun. A collective gasp went up from the people in the back row. Someone covered their mouth. The lawyer dropped his phone. Mr. Henderson actually took a step back. Hiding slightly behind his table, Arthur saw the fear in their eyes, and it seemed to pain him. He paused, his hand halfway into his pocket. He looked at the bailiff. "It is not a weapon," Arthur said quietly, his tone almost sad. "I am not here to hurt anyone." He pulled his hand out of the pocket. He wasn't holding a gun. He was holding a single folded piece of paper. It was yellowed with age, the edges soft and fraying from being handled so many times. He held it delicately with both hands, as if it were made of thin glass. The bailiff relaxed, but only a little. His hand stayed near his belt. "Put it on the table and leave," the bailiff ordered. Arthur ignored him. He looked at the judge. The judge was regaining his composure, puffing out his chest, angry that he had been scared for no reason. He looked at the paper with disdain. "Another handwritten note?" The judge sneered, leaning forward. "I told you I don't want to see it. If that is another one of your homemade complaints or drawings, I suggest you shred it right now. I have no more time for your nonsense. Get out." But Arthur didn't move toward the door. He took a slow, deep breath, filling his lungs with the stale air. He looked down at the paper in his hands, smoothing the crease with his thumb. He had carried this paper for a long time. He had hoped he would never have to use it in a place like this. He had hoped that people would just listen, that they would just care. But they didn't care. They only cared about money and speed. Arthur stepped up to the edge of the judge's high desk. He was close enough now that the judge could see the scars on Arthur's hands, the dirt under his fingernails from the garden that morning. The judge stopped shuffling papers. He looked into Arthur's eyes, and for the first time all morning, he actually saw him. He saw the pain, the resolve, and the history behind those eyes. Arthur laid the paper gently on the edge of the mahogany desk. He didn't slap it down. He placed it there with the respect he felt for what was written on it. "Your Honor is wrong," Arthur said softly. "I am not here to complain. I am here to introduce you to the men you just paved over." The judge looked down at the paper, then back up at Arthur. "What are you talking about?" Arthur didn't answer immediately. He just stood there, his hands clasped behind his back now, standing straight and tall, like a soldier on review. The courtroom waited. The silence was heavy, waiting for the explosion. Arthur knew that once he spoke the next sentence, there was no going back. The quiet would end. The storm would break. He looked the judge dead in the eye. With a calm that terrified everyone in the room, he prepared to speak. For a few long seconds, nobody moved. The air in the room felt heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm breaks. The judge stared at the piece of yellow paper resting on his mahogany desk, then up at Arthur's face. He expected to see anger, or maybe tears, but Arthur's face was completely blank. It was the look of a man who had accepted a heavy burden a long time ago and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. "I do not want to see another homemade drawing," the judge said, his voice trying to be loud, but sounding a little shaky. He reached out with a manicured finger to push the paper away, treating it like it was something dirty. "I told you, bailiff, remove this man. Now." The bailiff stepped forward again, his face red with embarrassment. He had let a confused old man scare him for a minute, and now he had to prove he was in control. He grabbed Arthur by the upper arm, gripping it tight this time. "Come on, pal," the bailiff said, his voice rough. "You had your chance. Let's go." Arthur didn't fight the grip, but he didn't help the bailiff either. He just stood there, making his body heavy and still. He kept his eyes locked on the paper. It was starting to slide across the desk because of the judge's push. Arthur leaned forward slightly, almost like he wanted to catch it before it fell. "That is not a drawing," Arthur said. His voice was low, but it cut through the bailiff's heavy breathing. "That is the only thing in this room that actually matters." The lawyer for Mr. Henderson stood up again. He smoothed his expensive suit and looked at the judge with a look of shared frustration. "Your Honor, this is clearly a mental health issue. My client is a busy man. We have construction crews waiting on site. We cannot be held hostage by a confused senior citizen. Please grant the order and let us get back to work." Henderson nodded in agreement, though he didn't speak. He looked nervous. He kept glancing at the door, wanting to be anywhere but here. He just wanted the signed paper so he could start pouring concrete. The judge rubbed his temples, feeling a headache coming on. He looked at the clock again. The delay was making him angry. "Fine," the judge snapped. "If he won't leave, arrest him. Charge him with contempt. I'll sign the paperwork downstairs. Just get him out of my sight." The bailiff nodded and began to pull Arthur toward the side door. Arthur's boots scuffed against the carpet. He was losing ground. The paper was sitting alone on the large desk, ignored and unclaimed. It looked so small next to the thick law books and the heavy wooden gavel. Arthur knew that if he walked out that door, the garden was gone. The bulldozers would be there by the afternoon. The bench, the flowers, the quiet place he built it, would all be gravel and noise by sunset. But something else would be gone too. The truth would be buried under the concrete, just like the bodies of his friends. He stopped walking. It was a sudden, violent stop. The bailiff stumbled, losing his balance for a second. "I am not going anywhere," Arthur said. He twisted his arm in a way that looked painful, wrenching it free from the bailiff's grip. Before the bailiff could grab him again, Arthur took 2 quick steps forward. He was right at the edge of the judge's desk now. "Get back!" The bailiff shouted, scrambling to recover. He reached for his handcuffs. The judge stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Sir, stop this, or I will have you locked away for the rest of your life." Arthur ignored the shouting. He reached out and placed his hand flat on the yellow paper, stopping it from sliding. He didn't look at the bailiff, and he didn't look at the lawyer. He looked at the judge. He leaned in close, invading the judge's personal space. "You were worried about your schedule," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow filled the whole room. "You are worried about concrete and money, but look at that paper. Just look at it." The judge froze. He had seen many angry people in his courtroom. He had seen people scream and cry and throw things, but he had never seen anything like this. Arthur wasn't acting crazy. He was acting with a terrifying sense of purpose. The lawyer cleared his throat, trying to break the tension. "Your Honor, I insist." "Shut up." The judge yelled without looking away from Arthur. The room went dead silent. The lawyer sat down, his mouth open in shock. Even Mr. Henderson looked stunned. No one spoke to high-priced lawyers like that in this court. The judge looked down at the paper under Arthur's hand. He wanted to throw it in the trash, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the way Arthur was looking at him, not with hate, but with intense, burning seriousness. The judge slowly sat back down. He realized that if he didn't look at the paper, this old man wasn't going to leave. And if the old man didn't leave, the court wasn't moving. "Fine," the judge said, trying to sound bored again. "I will look at your little note. Then you leave. Agreed?" Arthur slowly lifted his hand off the paper. He took a small step back, giving the judge room. He stood at attention, his hands clasped behind his back. It was the stance of a soldier waiting for inspection. The judge picked up the paper. It was old and brittle. The creases were worn white from being folded and unfolded many times. At the top, there was a faded logo. The judge squinted, trying to make it out. It wasn't a crayon drawing. It wasn't a handwritten complaint. It was a photocopy of a military document. The judge frowned. He recognized the format. It was an old casualty report from the army. He started to read. His eyes scanned the list of names. He read the date, 1971. He read the unit designation. Then his eyes stopped at the bottom. There was a description of the burial site. The coordinates were rough, handwritten in military script, but the description was clear. The judge's face went pale. He read the paragraph again, slower this time. It talked about a field retrieval. It talked about remains that couldn't be moved because of the condition of the transport vehicles and the heavy enemy fire. It said they were buried in a temporary marked grave in a field near a creek. Under a large oak tree, the judge looked up from the paper. He looked at the window, then back at the paper. He did the math in his head. 1971, Oak Creek Road, a large oak tree. He looked at Mr. Henderson. "Your property," the judge whispered. "The lot you are developing. Is there an oak tree on it?" Henderson stood up, confused by the sudden change in the room. Yes, Your Honor, a big old one." "It's in the way. We were planning to bulldoze it this afternoon to clear the space for the foundation." The judge's hand started to shake. The paper rustled in his grip. He looked back at Arthur. The old man was still standing there, a statue of calm. "Mr. Arthur," the judge said, his voice losing all of its power. "What is this? What am I holding?" Arthur took a deep breath. He had prepared for this moment for years, but saying the words out loud was harder than he thought. He felt the weight of 12 souls pressing down on his shoulders. He looked around the room at the people who had tried to silence him. He looked at the smug lawyer, the nervous developer, and the impatient bailiff. He leaned forward one last time. The silence in the room was absolute. You could hear a pin drop. Arthur spoke the words he had been carrying since the war ended. "Your Honor," Arthur said, his voice calm but filled with a quiet thunder. "This document verifies that the land you just signed away contains the unmarked mass grave of 12 soldiers that this government promised, in a signed 1972 congressional act, would never be disturbed." Ow. The words hit the room like a bomb. The lawyer dropped his pen. The bailiff's mouth fell open. Mr. Henderson turned white as a sheet. Grabbing the edge of his table for support, the judge stared at the paper, his eyes wide. He looked at the signature at the bottom of the documented general's signature. He looked at the raised seal stamped into the paper. It wasn't a fake. It wasn't a joke. The realization hit the judge like a bucket of ice water. He hadn't just dismissed a property dispute. He had just authorized the bulldozing of a war grave. He had almost sent a man to jail for protecting a cemetery. The arrogance drained out of him, replaced by a cold, creeping fear. He looked at Arthur, really seeing him for the first time not as a nuisance, but as a guardian. The judge opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He looked at the gavel in his hand, and suddenly, it felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The court wasn't upside down yet, but the ground had certainly shifted beneath their feet. For 10 agonizing seconds, the courtroom was trapped in a silence so thick it felt like the air had turned to glass. No one moved. No one breathed. It was as if the world had hit the pause button. waiting for the gravity of Arthur's words to fully crash down on them. The sentence hung in the air. Heavy and terrible, asterisk, mass grave of 12 soldiers. Asterisk, those words changed everything. In a single heartbeat, the story wasn't about a confused old man or a zoning dispute or a rich developer wanting to build a luxury apartment complex. It was about something sacred. It was about the dead. The judge sat frozen behind his desk, his hand hovering over the piece of yellow paper. His eyes were wide, darting back and forth between the document and Arthur's face. He looked like a man who had just stepped onto a landmine. The arrogance that had fueled him all morning. The arrogance that made him think he could clear his docket by pushing around a poor veteran instantly. It was replaced by a cold, creeping horror. He looked at the signature on the paper again. It was the signature of a deceased 3-star general, a man famous in the history books. It was stamped with an official seal from the Department of the Army dated 1972. This wasn't something Arthur had typed up on a home computer. This was history. This was the truth. Slowly, painfully, the judge lifted his gaze to the defense table. He looked at Mr. Henderson. The developer was standing, but he wasn't looking confident anymore. He looked like he might be sick. His face had lost all its color, turning a pasty shade of white. His expensive suit suddenly looked like a costume. He was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were turning white. He knew what this meant. If there was a mass grave on his land, he couldn't build. Not ever. The land was toxic now, not physically, but spiritually. You cannot build condos on top of a tomb. Mr. Henderson, the judge said, his voice barely a whisper. It cracked in the middle of the sentence. Did you know about this? Henderson opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at his lawyer, panic in his eyes. The lawyer stood up, but his usual smooth confidence was gone. He looked flustered. He adjusted his tie, clearing his throat nervously. Your Honor, the lawyer stammered, this is clearly a mistake. Or perhaps a fabrication. We did a title search. We did a survey. There is no record of a cemetery on that plot. This is just a tactic to delay the construction. Arthur didn't shout. He didn't get angry. He just shook his head slowly, a look of deep sadness on his face. He pointed a calloused finger at the paper on the desk. The government didn't advertise it, Arthur said, his voice quiet but cutting through the lawyer's stuttering. They didn't want the families to have to pay for the bodies to come home during the war. They buried them quickly and quietly. They promised they would come back for them, but they never did. I came back instead. The judge felt a chill run down his spine. He looked at the date on the paper. 1972. That was 50 years ago. He looked at Arthur, standing there in his field jacket. Arthur would have been a young man then, a young soldier left to pick up the pieces while the world moved on. The realization hit the judge like a physical blow. He had almost just sent this man to jail for trying to keep a promise to his dead friends. The courtroom was starting to buzz now. The people in the gallery were whispering excitedly. They had come for a show, and now they were getting one. The news cameras from the local station, which were always rolling in the corner for interesting cases, zoomed in on the yellow paper. The reporters in the back row were frantically typing on their phones. The secret was out. The bailiff looked at the judge, waiting for an order. He didn't know what to do. Should he arrest Arthur? Or should he stand guard? The dynamic had shifted so violently that no one knew what the rules were anymore. The judge picked up his gavel. But he didn't bang it. He just held it, his hand trembling. He needed time to think. He needed to stop this train before it went off the cliff. He felt like he was already dangling over the edge. He looked at the lawyer. Counselor, sit down. And tell your client to be quiet. The lawyer sat down instantly. He knew when the wind had changed. He knew that fighting this was dangerous now. If they bulldozed that site, and the bodies were found on the news, it would be a disaster. It would be the end of Mr. Henderson's career. The judge took a deep breath. He looked at Arthur. The old man hadn't moved. He was still standing at attention, but his shoulders slumped slightly. He looked tired. He looked like he had carried this weight for 50 years and was finally, just for a moment, letting someone else hold it. Mr. Arthur, the judge said. His tone was completely different now. It wasn't commanding. It was almost respectful. This document. It claims the remains are. Where exactly? Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded map. It was an old topographic map, creased and torn. He walked over to the bailiff, who didn't stop him this time, and gently placed it on the desk next to the yellow paper. Right there, Arthur said, pointing to a spot on the map with a finger that shook just a little. Under the big oak tree, near the creek bend. That is where we put them. The judge looked at the map, then at the document, then back at Arthur. He did the math in his head again. Oak tree. Creek bend. It matched Henderson's property description perfectly. The pit in his stomach grew larger. He had signed an eviction notice for a graveyard. Your Honor, Mr. Henderson squeaked, standing up again. He couldn't help himself. This is absurd. Even if it is true, which I am not saying it is, that was 50 years ago. Who cares? It's just dirt. We need housing. We need progress. The room gasped. It was the wrong thing to say. Arthur turned to look at him. His eyes were cold, colder than the judge had ever seen. It was the look of a man who has seen death, who has held his friends as they died, who has smelled the blood and the smoke. Just dirt? Arthur asked, his voice low and dangerous. That dirt has the blood of men who died for this country, Mr. Henderson. They died so you could wear that suit and stand in this court and act like you are better than everyone else. It is not just dirt. It is hallowed ground. The bailiff stepped in front of Henderson, sensing the tension. Sir, I suggest you stay quiet, he warned. The judge slammed his hand down on the desk. Not a gavel bang, but a slap of frustration. Enough. He yelled, I will not have that kind of talk in my courtroom. He looked at the paper one last time. The words Congressional Act seemed to jump off the page. A federal act. That meant this wasn't just a local issue anymore. This was federal. If the judge enforced his eviction order, he would be violating a federal act. He would be complicit in a crime, he realized, with a sinking heart, that he had made a terrible mistake. He had let his impatience and his bias blind him. He had judged a book by its cover, and now he was reading the most important page of his life. The judge looked up, his eyes meeting Arthur's. For the first time, he saw the man, not the defendant. He saw the lines on his face, the faded jacket, the shaking hands. He saw a hero. Mr. Arthur, the judge said, his voice soft. I need to reassess. I need to review this document with the court clerk and verify this. Arthur nodded slowly. He knew what that meant. It meant the judge was scared. It meant the game was over. Take your time, Arthur said. I have waited 50 years. I can wait a little longer. The judge stood up. His legs felt weak. He grabbed the folder with the Henderson case in it. He didn't want to leave it on the desk where the cameras could see it. He wanted to hide it. I am calling a 10-minute recess, the judge announced to the room, his voice echoing. He didn't bang the gavel. He just turned and walked quickly toward the door that led to his chambers. He didn't look at Mr. Henderson. He didn't look at the bailiff. He just walked away, holding the yellow paper like it was burning his hand. As the heavy wooden door clicked shut behind the judge, the room erupted. The silence broke. People started talking at once. The reporters rushed the bailiff, asking questions. Mr. Henderson was yelling at his lawyer, his face purple with rage. The lawyer was trying to pack his briefcase, his hand shaking so badly he dropped his phone on the floor. But Arthur just stood there in the middle of the chaos. He watched the judge disappear behind the door. He watched the panic spreading through the room. He felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He had turned the court upside down, just like he said he would. He had spoken his one calm sentence, and it had hit harder than any weapon. He walked back to his bench and sat down. He picked up his folder and held it close to his chest. He knew that when they came back, the eviction order would be torn up. He knew the bulldozers would be stopped. He knew his friends could rest. But as he sat there, watching the rich men panic and the lawyers scramble, he didn't feel happy. He just felt tired. He looked at the empty bench where the judge had been sitting. Power, Arthur thought. It's a fragile thing. It can be shattered by a single piece of paper. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the noise of the room. It was the sound of the system breaking down, crashing under the weight of the truth, and he was the one who had pulled the lever. The heavy wooden door to the judge's chambers clicked shut, but the noise in the courtroom didn't settle down. Instead, it grew. It was a chaotic hum of whispering, shuffling feet, and the frantic tapping of cell phone keyboards. The air in the room had changed completely. No one was bored anymore. No one was checking their watch. In the front row, Mr. Henderson was sweating. It wasn't a warm day, but beads of moisture were gathering on his forehead and upper lip. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on a sinking ship. He grabbed his lawyer's arm, his grip tight and desperate. "Do something," Henderson hissed, his voice cracking. "Call the office. Stop the crews. Tell them not to touch anything until I say so." The lawyer looked pale. He was staring at the spot on the judge's desk where the yellow paper had been. "I'm trying, but this is bad, Mr. Henderson. If the news gets a hold of a story about us bulldozing a war grave, we are finished. The city will pull our permits. The investors will run." Arthur sat quietly on the wooden bench, listening to the panic unfold behind him. He didn't turn around. He didn't have a smug smile on his face. He just sat with his hands resting on his knees, breathing slowly in and out. He felt a heavy sense of relief, but it was a tired relief. He had spent so much energy fighting, shouting, and pleading over the years. Today, he hadn't needed to shout. The truth had done the shouting for him. 10 minutes passed, though it felt like an hour to the people waiting. Finally, the door to the chambers opened. The judge walked back out. He looked different. His shoulders were slumped, and the confident, impatient stride was gone. He walked slowly to his chair and sat down heavily. He didn't look at the stack of files. He didn't look at the clock. He looked down at his hands, which were folded on the desk. The room went silent instantly. The bailiff stepped forward. "All rise," he said, but his voice lacked the usual shout. It was more of a formality. "Please be seated," the judge said quietly. He looked over at Mr. Henderson and his lawyer. For a moment, the old arrogance flashed in his eyes, but it was weak. It was like a candle flickering in the wind. "Mr. Henderson," the judge began, "I have just gotten off the phone with the Department of the Army and the State Historical Preservation Office." A collective gasp ran through the courtroom. The reporters in the back row leaned forward, pens poised over their notebooks. "They confirmed the document," the judge continued, his voice thick. "They confirmed that the site in question is indeed a registered burial site. It was never marked on the city maps due to a clerical error in the 1980s. But the federal protection order from 1972 is still active." Mr. Henderson closed his eyes. He looked like he wanted to vanish through the floor. "Therefore," the judge said, picking up the gavel, but hesitating, "therefore my previous ruling is vacated. It is void. The order of eviction is canceled immediately." Arthur didn't cheer. He just nodded once. A small, slow nod. It was enough. "The site is now under federal jurisdiction," the judge said, sounding exhausted. "Mr. Henderson, I am advising you to withdraw your construction crews immediately. If any heavy equipment enters that perimeter, you will be facing federal charges, not just a local fine." Henderson stood up. He didn't argue. He didn't cite property rights. He just gathered his briefcase and nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, understood." He and his lawyer practically fled the courtroom, pushing past the reporters without saying a word. They were running away from the disaster they had almost caused. The judge looked at Arthur. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. When he put the glasses back on, he looked at the old man with a look of genuine shame. "Mr. Arthur," the judge said, I owe you an apology." Arthur stood up. He buttoned his field jacket, smoothing the fabric with his hand. "I was wrong," the judge continued, his voice low enough that only the front few rows could hear. "I was impatient. I dismissed you because of how you looked, not because of the facts. I failed this court, and I failed the memory of the men you came here to protect." Arthur walked to the podium. He placed his hand on the worn wood. He looked at the judge, not with anger, but with understanding. "Wow. We all get tired, Your Honor, Arthur said softly. We all make mistakes when we are rushing. You were just doing your job the way the system taught you. The system is broken, but maybe today we fixed a tiny piece of it. The judge nodded. He swallowed hard. The case is dismissed, he said, but this time the word dismissed meant freedom, with prejudice. And Mr. Arthur, if you ever need anything from this court, you come to the front of the line. Arthur gave a small salute. It wasn't a mockery of the court. It was a sign of respect between two soldiers, even if only one of them had worn the uniform. Thank you, Your Honor. Act. Arthur picked up his folder. He turned around and walked down the center aisle. The people in the pews didn't look at him with pity anymore. They moved their legs out of the way, making room for him. Some nodded. An older woman in the back row even reached out and patted his arm as he passed. It was a silent gesture of thanks. He pushed through the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom and stepped out into the hallway. The air was cooler there. It smelled of floor wax and old dust, but it smelled free. He walked toward the exit, his boots echoing on the tiled floor. His step was a little lighter than it had been that morning. The burden he had carried for 30 years, the weight of the garden, the fear of the bulldozers, the anger at the system, was finally gone. He pushed open the main doors and stepped outside. The sun was bright, forcing him to squint. The city noise of traffic and people talking rushed at him, but it didn't bother him. He pulled a pair of sunglasses from his pocket and put them on. He walked toward the bus stop. He didn't have a car, and it was a long ride to the edge of town. But he didn't mind. He would get there. He knew that tomorrow the fences would go up. He knew that men in uniforms would come with machines that beeped and scanned the ground. He knew they would find the bodies. And after that, the real work would begin. They would give his friends the proper burial. They had been denied for 50 years. Arthur sat down on the metal bench at the bus stop. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver compass. It was old and scratched. He rubbed his thumb over the glass face.
Aye.
We did it, boys, he whispered to the wind. We can rest now. The city bus pulled up to the curb, hissing as the doors folded open. Arthur stood up. He didn't look back at the courthouse. He didn't need to. The war was over. He climbed the steps of the bus, dropped his tokens in the box, and found a seat by the window. As the bus pulled away from the curb, merging into the flow of traffic, Arthur leaned back and closed his eyes, finally at peace.